On a cold February night in 1982, Patricia Ann Morrison adjusted her white nurse's cap in the dimly lit hallway of Georgetown Memorial Hospital and began her shift, believing the most dangerous thing she would encounter was the occasional combative patient suffering from alcohol withdrawal, or the endless paperwork that accompanied overnight nursing duties in the cardiac care unit. She had no reason to suspect that a routine medication delivery to a seemingly ordinary patient recovering from bypass surgery would expose her to one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations ever conducted on American soil, transforming a 44-year-old widow with 3 children into an unwitting participant in a counter-espionage case that would ultimately reach the desk of the President of the United States and expose vulnerabilities in hospital security that intelligence agencies had never considered. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Patricia Morrison was a woman whose life had been shaped by circumstances beyond her control and choices made from necessity rather than ambition. She was 44 years old that winter, a registered nurse with 19 years of experience in cardiac care, most of it spent working the night shift that paid slightly more than day shifts and allowed her to be home when her children returned from school. Her husband Michael had died 6 years earlier when his heart simply stopped while he was mowing their lawn in suburban Maryland. He was 41 years old, an accountant with no prior health problems, and the autopsy revealed massive coronary disease that had somehow escaped detection during his annual physical examinations. The life insurance policy had been sufficient to pay off the mortgage, but not enough to eliminate Patricia's need to work, so she had continued at Georgetown Memorial, taking extra shifts when possible and living with the constant low-level anxiety that characterizes single parents who know there is no safety net beneath them if they stumble. The hospital was a teaching institution affiliated with Georgetown University, a sprawling complex of brick buildings connected by underground tunnels and above-ground walkways, serving the wealthy neighborhoods of Northwest Washington as well as the inner-city population that arrived by ambulance from areas where violence and poverty exacted a steady toll on human bodies. The cardiac care unit occupied the 5th floor of the main tower, a 16-bed unit with sophisticated monitoring equipment and a nursing staff that prided themselves on maintaining the lowest mortality rate in the region. Patricia had started working nights shortly after Michael's death, partly for the differential pay, but also because the nocturnal rhythm suited her temperament. The quietness of the hospital after visiting hours ended. The dimmed lights in patient rooms, the absence of administrators, and the endless stream of consultants who populated the hallways during daylight hours, all of this created an atmosphere where Patricia could focus on the essential work of nursing without the distractions that exhausted her during day shifts. Night shift nursing in 1982 required a particular kind of vigilance. The patients were often more unstable than those on general medical floors, their heart rhythms monitored continuously on screens at the central nurses' station, alarms sounding with regularity to alert staff when something deviated from expected parameters. Patricia had learned to distinguish between alarms that signaled genuine emergencies and those triggered by patients moving in their sleep or loose electrode connections. She could interpret cardiac monitor strips with a skill that often impressed the medical residents who rotated through the unit, and she had developed an almost intuitive sense for when patients were about to deteriorate, often calling for physician evaluation before objective signs of trouble manifested. Her colleagues respected her competence and her willingness to take on the most difficult patient assignments, though some found her personally distant, attributing this reserve to grief that had never fully resolved. The patient in room 512 had arrived from the operating room 3 days earlier. Following coronary artery bypass surgery, performed by Dr. Theodore Christensen, one of the hospital's senior cardiac surgeons. The chart identified him as David Mitchell, 56 years old, a consultant for an agricultural equipment company based in Iowa who had suffered a heart attack while attending a conference in Washington. He had been rushed to Georgetown Memorial because it was the closest hospital to his hotel, and the angiogram performed in the emergency department had revealed severe triple vessel disease requiring immediate surgical intervention. The surgery had been technically successful, and Mitchell's recovery had proceeded without complications. He was pleasant and cooperative, thanking the nursing staff for their care and following instructions about coughing, deep breathing, and ambulation with the diligence of someone who understood that his survival depended on proper adherence to the post-operative protocol. Patricia had cared for Mitchell on each of her shifts since his surgery, and she had noted nothing unusual about him beyond a slight accent that she could not quite place. He told her he had grown up in various parts of the Midwest, as his father moved between farming communities, working as an agricultural engineer, which explained why his speech patterns seemed to contain elements from different regions. He was divorced, he said, with 2 grown children who lived in California, and who had been notified of his surgery but would not be visiting because of the expense and distance. He was stoic about this, mentioning it matter-of-factly when Patricia asked about family contacts for discharge planning. Most patients in similar situations expressed some emotion when discussing absent family members, but Mitchell simply stated the facts and moved on to other topics. On this particular February night, Patricia arrived for her shift at 11:00 p.m. and received report from the evening nurse, Martha Chen, a recent graduate who was still adjusting to the intensity of cardiac nursing. Martha reported that Mitchell had been stable throughout the evening, his vital signs normal, his incision site clean and dry, his pain controlled with oral medication. He had walked the length of the hallway twice with assistance, eaten most of his dinner, and spent the evening watching television news and reading a paperback novel. Everything about his status suggested a textbook recovery. Patricia thanked Martha and settled in for what she anticipated would be a routine shift, with Mitchell requiring only periodic checks and the midnight dose of antibiotics that all post-operative cardiac patients received. At 12:30 in the morning, Patricia entered room 512, carrying the antibiotic medication in a small plastic cup, along with Mitchell's scheduled cardiac medications. The room was dimly lit by a single fluorescent panel behind the bed, providing enough illumination for Patricia to see without disturbing Mitchell if he was sleeping. But Mitchell was awake, sitting up in bed with his reading light on, the paperback novel resting on his lap. He smiled when Patricia entered, the polite expression of a cooperative patient who understood that middle-of-the-night intrusions were necessary inconveniences. Patricia identified herself as she always did, confirmed Mitchell's identity by checking his wristband, and explained which medications she was administering. Mitchell nodded and accepted the pills, swallowing them with water from the plastic pitcher on his bedside table. As Patricia was documenting the medication administration in Mitchell's chart, she noticed his personal belongings arranged on the narrow shelf beneath the window. This was standard in hospital rooms. Patients accumulated items over the course of their stays like books, magazines, toiletries, cards from well-wishers, and the various small comforts that made the sterile environment more tolerable. What caught Patricia's attention was a leather-bound appointment book, the expensive kind with gold-edged pages that executives carried to track meetings and commitments. The book had fallen open, and from her angle near the door, Patricia could see that the visible pages were filled with handwritten notations. This itself was unremarkable, except that the writing appeared to be in 2 different languages, with some entries in English and others in what looked like Cyrillic script. Patricia felt a small flutter of unease, that she could not immediately explain. Many people in Washington were multilingual, particularly those involved in international business or diplomatic work. Mitchell had mentioned working for an agricultural equipment company, and such companies often did business with foreign countries, including those in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. There could be dozens of innocent explanations for why a business consultant would keep notes in Russian. But something about the juxtaposition of the English and Cyrillic text, combined with Mitchell's vague background story and the absence of visiting family members, triggered a warning signal that Patricia's instincts told her deserved attention. She finished charting Mitchell's medications and left the room without mentioning what she had seen. But her mind continued working through the observation as she moved on to check her other patients. Patricia had grown up during the height of the Cold War, had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War, had watched countless news reports about Soviet espionage and the ongoing tension between the superpowers. She subscribed to the Washington Post and read it every morning before sleeping. And she was aware that the capital city harbored numerous foreign intelligence operatives conducting surveillance and gathering classified information. But she had never imagined that such activities might intersect with her work as a cardiac nurse. Over the next hour, Patricia found herself returning mentally to the image of Mitchell's appointment book. She tried to dismiss her suspicions as the product of an overactive imagination fed by too many spy novels and news reports, but she could not shake the feeling that something was off about the man in room 512. His story was too vague, his demeanor too carefully maintained, his isolation too complete. Most patients recovering from major cardiac surgery showed more vulnerability, more emotional variability, more need for human connection. Mitchell remained consistently pleasant and cooperative, but with an odd emotional flatness that suggested someone performing a role rather than simply being himself. At 2:00 a.m., Patricia took her break in the small staff lounge adjacent to the cardiac care unit. Her colleague, James Hutchison, a nurse with 12 years of experience, was already there drinking coffee and working on a crossword puzzle. Patricia sat down with her own coffee and mentioned casually that the patient in 512 seemed unusual to her, though she could not articulate exactly why. James looked up from his puzzle and asked what she meant. Patricia described Mitchell's lack of visitors, his vague background story, and the appointment book with mixed language entries. James considered this for a moment, then shrugged and said that plenty of people in Washington worked in international business and maintained notes in multiple languages. He suggested that Patricia was probably just tired and seeing patterns where none existed. But Patricia could not let it go. During her 3:00 a.m. rounds, she paused outside, room 512, and observed Mitchell through the small window in the door. He was awake, sitting up in bed with a small notepad balanced on his knee, writing something with careful deliberation. The reading light cast his face in sharp relief, and Patricia noticed for the first time how his eyes moved as he wrote, scanning the room periodically with a watchfulness that seemed inconsistent with someone recovering from major surgery in the security of a hospital room. Most patients in Mitchell's situation were focused inward, dealing with pain and discomfort and the mental adjustment to their altered health status. Mitchell appeared to be monitoring his environment, alert and assessing in a way that struck Patricia as distinctly unusual. At 4:00 a.m., Patricia returned to Mitchell's room to check his vital signs and assess his incision site. As she approached his bedside, she noticed that the appointment book was no longer on the shelf beneath the window. Mitchell must have put it away, perhaps in the small closet where his street clothes hung, or in the drawer of the bedside table. The notepad he had been writing on was also gone. Mitchell greeted her pleasantly and cooperated with the examination, His vital signs remained stable, and his incision showed appropriate healing. Patricia completed her assessment and left the room, but her unease had deepened into something approaching conviction. Mitchell was hiding something, and his behavior suggested someone who was conscious of being observed and was taking steps to conceal activities that should not concern someone whose only focus was recovering from surgery. At 5:30 a.m., as Patricia was preparing to give her end-of-shift report to the day shift staff, she made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life and potentially impact national security. She went to the telephone at the nurses' station and called Georgetown Hospital's security office, asking to speak with the night supervisor. When a tired-sounding man identified himself as Officer Raymond Parker, Patricia explained that she had concerns about a patient in the cardiac care unit and requested that someone come up to discuss the situation. Parker asked if this was a medical emergency or a security issue, and Patricia said she was not entirely sure but felt it warranted attention. Parker said he would send someone up within 15 minutes. Officer Thomas Brennan arrived at the cardiac care unit at 5:50 a.m., a solidly built man in his early 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent time in military service before transitioning to hospital security work. Patricia met him in the staff lounge and explained her observations about Mitchell, the mixed language appointment book, the vague background story, the absence of visitors, and the general sense that something did not fit. As she spoke, she felt increasingly foolish, aware that she was reporting suspicions based on nothing concrete, impressions that could easily be explained by innocent circumstances. But Brennan listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, taking occasional notes in a small leather notebook. When Patricia finished, Brennan asked several questions about Mitchell's behavior, his daily routine, his interactions with staff and other patients. Patricia answered as completely as she could, and Brennan continued taking notes. Finally, Brennan closed his notebook and told Patricia that he would look into the matter. He emphasized that she had done the right thing by reporting her concerns, that hospital security took all reports seriously, and that she should continue caring for Mitchell as usual without altering her behavior in any way that might alert him to her suspicions. He also told Patricia, with careful emphasis, that she should not discuss this conversation with anyone, not her colleagues, not her supervisor, not even her family. Patricia agreed, though the warning made her newly anxious. If hospital security was taking her report this seriously, then perhaps Mitchell really was something other than an ordinary businessman recovering from heart surgery. Thomas Brennan returned to the security office and sat at his desk for several minutes, considering what Patricia Morrison had told him. Brennan was a former Army military police officer who had served in Germany during the early 1970s, and he had received training in threat assessment and counterintelligence awareness. One of the things he had learned during that training was that Soviet intelligence services occasionally placed operatives in situations where they would have access to sensitive locations or personnel, and that these operatives often maintained cover stories that were plausible on the surface but contained subtle inconsistencies when examined more carefully. A businessman from Iowa suffering a heart attack while attending a conference in Washington was exactly the kind of cover story that would provide an intelligence officer with a legitimate reason to be in the capital city while remaining in a location where he could conduct communications or meetings away from his usual monitoring. At 6:30 a.m., Brennan called his supervisor, the hospital's director of security, Edward Walsh, at home. Walsh had not yet left for work, and he sounded annoyed at being called about what Brennan initially described as a possible security concern. But as Brennan explained Patricia Morrison's observations and his own assessment, Walsh's tone shifted from irritation to serious attention. Walsh told Brennan to document everything and said he would be at the hospital within 30 minutes. He also told Brennan to contact the FBI's Washington field office and report the situation, emphasizing that if there was any possibility that a foreign intelligence operative was using the hospital as a base of operations, federal authorities needed to be involved immediately. At 7:15 a.m., Brennan spoke with Special Agent Robert Callahan at the FBI field office. Callahan listened to Brennan's report and asked detailed questions about Mitchell's identity, his admission to the hospital, the circumstances of his surgery, and Patricia Morrison's specific observations. Brennan provided all the information he had, and Callahan told him to maintain normal operations at the hospital, to ensure that Mitchell was not alerted to any suspicions, and to expect FBI agents to arrive for interviews within a few hours. Callahan also instructed Brennan to secure Mitchell's medical records and any personal property inventories, and to provide copies to the FBI upon request. Patricia Morrison completed her shift at 7:30 a.m. and gave report to the day shift nurse assigned to Mitchell's care. She mentioned nothing about her conversation with security, maintaining the same professional demeanor she always displayed. But as she walked to her car in the hospital parking lot, she felt a mixture of apprehension and doubt. Had she overreacted to innocent circumstances? Would her report result in embarrassment for herself and the hospital when Mitchell turned out to be exactly who he claimed to be? Or had she genuinely identified a threat that required investigation? The uncertainty gnawed at her during the drive home, and she found herself reviewing the details repeatedly, searching for confirmation that her instincts had been correct. That afternoon, while Patricia was sleeping, FBI Special Agents Callahan and Jennifer Martinez arrived at Georgetown Memorial Hospital and met with Edward Walsh and Thomas Brennan in a conference room far from the cardiac care unit. The agents examined Mitchell's admission records, which showed he had arrived at the emergency department on February 10th, complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath. The angiogram had revealed severe coronary disease, and Dr. Christensen had recommended immediate surgery, which Mitchell had agreed to after signing the necessary consent forms. His insurance information showed coverage through a policy issued by a major carrier, and his billing address was listed as Cedar Rapids, Iowa. His next of kin was listed as his ex-wife, Sarah Mitchell, with a California phone number. Agent Martinez called the California number, while Agent Callahan continued reviewing Mitchell's file. A woman answered and confirmed that she was Sarah Mitchell, that she had been married to David Mitchell from 1968 to 1979, and that her ex-husband worked for an agricultural equipment company and traveled frequently for business. When Martinez asked if Sarah knew that David had undergone heart surgery, she said that David's brother had called her with the information, but that she had decided not to travel to Washington because their relationship had ended badly and she no longer felt obligated to provide support during medical crises. The conversation confirmed at least part of Mitchell's story, though it did not eliminate the possibility that the identity itself was fabricated, or that Mitchell was using legitimate background information to support a cover identity. Agent Callahan requested that the hospital provide 24-hour security surveillance of room 512, with officers monitoring who entered and left, and documenting any visitors or phone calls Mitchell received. He also requested that nursing staff report any unusual behavior or requests Mitchell made. The agents emphasized that Mitchell should not be approached or questioned, that normal hospital operations should continue, and that the investigation must remain completely confidential to avoid alerting Mitchell if he was indeed conducting intelligence activities. Edward Walsh agreed to these arrangements and assigned 2 experienced security officers to maintain constant but discreet observation of the 5th floor. Over the next 3 days, FBI surveillance documented Mitchell's activities in the hospital. He followed the normal post-operative routine, walking the hallways with increasing stamina, eating regular meals, watching television, and reading. He received no visitors and made no phone calls. His behavior appeared entirely consistent with someone recovering from cardiac surgery. But Agent Callahan had ordered a deeper investigation into Mitchell's background, and what that investigation revealed raised significant concerns about Patricia Morrison's initial suspicions. The agricultural equipment company that Mitchell claimed to work for existed, and their records showed a David Mitchell employed as a consultant specializing in sales to Eastern European markets. But when FBI agents interviewed the company's executives, they discovered that Mitchell had been hired 5 years earlier with credentials that appeared legitimate at the time, but that had never been thoroughly verified because the position did not require security clearance or access to classified information. The company's files contained copies of Mitchell's resume, references, and educational transcripts, all of which appeared genuine, but none of which had been independently confirmed through contact with the institutions listed. More significantly, the FBI's background check revealed that the Social Security number associated with David Mitchell had been issued in 1955 to a David Mitchell who had died in a car accident in 1977. Someone had appropriated the identity of a deceased person and constructed an elaborate cover story supported by fabricated documents, a technique known to be used by Soviet illegal agents operating under deep cover in the United States. The discovery transformed Patricia Morrison's observations from interesting curiosities into potential evidence of a sophisticated espionage operation. On February 22nd, 8 days after Patricia's initial report, FBI agents executed a search warrant on Mitchell's hotel room, where his belongings had been stored since his emergency hospitalization. The search revealed materials that confirmed Mitchell was not who he claimed to be, hidden in a quotes. False bottom of his suitcase, agents found a sophisticated shortwave radio capable of receiving encrypted transmissions, microfilm containing photographed documents that appeared to be technical specifications for satellite communication systems, and a second passport issued under a different name with Mitchell's photograph. Most damning was a small notebook containing what cryptanalysis experts later determined were one-time pad codes used for encrypting messages to be transmitted to Soviet intelligence handlers. The FBI now faced a decision about how to proceed. They could arrest Mitchell immediately based on the evidence recovered from his hotel room, but doing so would alert his intelligence network that he had been compromised and would provide no opportunity to identify his contacts or learn about his mission. Alternatively, they could allow Mitchell to complete his recovery and leave the hospital while maintaining surveillance, potentially gathering additional intelligence about his activities and contacts. After consultation with senior officials at FBI headquarters and the CIA, the decision was made to continue surveillance and use Mitchell's hospitalization as an opportunity to replace his communication materials with altered versions that would allow American intelligence to monitor and potentially manipulate his future communications with Moscow. On February 25th, while Mitchell was in physical therapy undergoing cardiac rehabilitation exercises, FBI technical specialists entered room 512 under the guise of hospital maintenance workers and conducted a thorough search of his personal belongings. They photographed everything, copied the contents of his appointment book, including the Cyrillic entries, and replaced his one-time pad with an identical-looking version that had been altered in ways that would allow the FBI to decrypt his future messages. The operation took less than 20 minutes, and Mitchell never knew his materials had been compromised. Patricia Morrison continued caring for Mitchell during her night shifts, unaware that the patient in room 512 had become the focus of a major counterintelligence operation. She noticed increased security presence on the floor, but attributed this to the hospital's general concerns about theft and patient safety. Mitchell remained pleasant and cooperative with her, and Patricia maintained her professional demeanor despite the knowledge that her initial report had triggered an investigation. She had been contacted by Agent Martinez and asked to provide a formal statement about her observations, and she had done so during a meeting at the FBI field office on her day off. Martinez had thanked her for her vigilance and emphasized that she should continue her normal routine without discussing the matter with anyone. On March 3rd, David Mitchell was discharged from Georgetown Memorial Hospital with instructions for follow-up cardiac care and prescriptions for medications to manage his heart disease. Patricia was not working that day, but she learned from her colleagues that Mitchell had left the hospital accompanied by a man who identified himself as a business associate who would drive Mitchell back to his hotel. The associate was actually an FBI agent, and Mitchell was under constant surveillance from the moment he left the hospital grounds. Over the following weeks, FBI observation teams documented Mitchell's activities as he slowly resumed normal functions, attending follow-up appointments with Dr. Christensen, spending time in his hotel room, and eventually preparing to return to Iowa. What Mitchell did not know was that every communication he sent using his compromised one-time pad was being intercepted and decrypted by the FBI. Through these communications, American intelligence learned that Mitchell's real name was Alexei Volkov, that he was a colonel in the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, and that his mission in Washington involved gathering information about American satellite surveillance capabilities and establishing contact with a source inside the Department of Defense who had been providing classified information about the development of new reconnaissance systems. The intelligence gained from monitoring Volkov's communications led to the identification of the Department of Defense source, a mid-level analyst named Robert Jensen, who had been selling information to Soviet intelligence for 3 years. In June of 1982, 4 months after Patricia Morrison's initial report, the FBI arrested both Volkov and Jensen in coordinated operations that dismantled the entire intelligence network. Volkov was charged with espionage and conspiracy, and after lengthy negotiations between the United States and Soviet Union, he was eventually exchanged for an American intelligence officer held in Moscow. Jensen was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. The case made national headlines, though the specific details of how Volkov had been identified remained classified for many years to protect intelligence sources and methods. Patricia Morrison's role in the case was not publicly revealed. She received a letter of commendation from the FBI director acknowledging her contribution to national security, but the letter was classified and could not be shown to anyone outside a small circle of cleared officials. Hospital administrators knew only that one of their nurses had reported security concerns that had led to a federal investigation, and Patricia received a private commendation from the hospital's chief executive recognizing her vigilance, though without explaining the specific circumstances. Her colleagues on the cardiac care unit never learned why security presence had increased on the floor during Mitchell's stay, or that the pleasant patient in room 512 had been a Soviet intelligence officer. For Patricia, the experience was profoundly unsettling. She had acted on instinct and observation, reporting concerns that could easily have been dismissed as paranoid imagination, and those concerns had turned out to be legitimate. But she took no satisfaction in being proven correct. The knowledge that a foreign intelligence operative had been conducting espionage operations from a hospital bed, that his presence had put the institution and potentially its patients at risk, troubled her deeply. She found herself reviewing the care she had provided Mitchell, wondering if anything she had said or done had inadvertently assisted his activities or compromised security. Agent Martinez assured her during a follow-up meeting that her nursing care had been entirely appropriate and that nothing she had done had helped Volkov's intelligence operations. but Patricia remained disturbed by how completely she had been deceived by his cover identity. The case also raised questions about hospital security that had never been seriously considered before. Hospitals were places of healing, environments where people were at their most vulnerable, and where staff focused on medical care rather than counterintelligence concerns. The idea that foreign intelligence services might use hospitalizations as opportunities for conducting operations had simply not been part of the security calculus. Following the Volkov case, the FBI conducted briefings for hospital administrators across the Washington area, educating them about the potential for intelligence operatives to exploit medical facilities and providing guidance on how to identify and report suspicious circumstances. Georgetown Memorial implemented new security protocols that required additional screening of patients and visitors, though these measures had to be balanced against the institution's commitment to providing compassionate care. Patricia Morrison continued working at Georgetown Memorial for another 8 years, retiring in 1990 at the age of 52 after 27 years in nursing. She never discussed the Volkov case with her children or friends, honoring the confidentiality requirements that had been imposed when she became involved in the investigation. Her colleagues remembered her as an exceptionally competent nurse with strong clinical instincts, though few understood the full scope of her vigilance or the role she had played in exposing a significant national security threat. She spent her retirement years gardening, traveling, and spending time with her grandchildren, living a quiet life far removed from the world of espionage and counterintelligence. In 1995, following the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the FBI declassified portions of the Volkov case as part of a broader effort to document Cold War intelligence operations. A brief mention appeared in a government report about Soviet espionage activities in the United States, noting that a GRU officer operating under deep cover had been identified and arrested in Washington in 1982, and that the initial break in the case had come from a civilian who had observed suspicious behavior and reported it to authorities. The report did not name Patricia Morrison or provide details about the circumstances, but it acknowledged that vigilant citizens had played crucial roles in protecting national security during the Cold War era. In 2003, a historian writing a book about Soviet intelligence operations in the United States contacted Patricia Morrison, requesting an interview about the Volkov case. Patricia declined, explaining that she preferred to keep that chapter of her life private and that she had never sought recognition for her role in the investigation. The historian respected her wishes, though he included a brief footnote in his book noting that the Volkov case had begun with an observant hospital employee who had recognized behavioral inconsistencies that trained intelligence officers might have missed. The footnote did not identify Patricia by name or specify that she was a nurse, describing her only as someone who had access to the subject during a medical treatment and who had the judgment to report her concerns to appropriate authorities. Patricia Morrison died in 2016 at the age of 78, following a brief illness. Her obituary in the Washington Post mentioned her long career in nursing at Georgetown Memorial Hospital and her dedication to cardiac care, noting that she had received commendations for her clinical excellence and her contributions to patient safety. The obituary did not mention the Volkov case or Patricia's role in exposing Soviet espionage activities, because even decades later, the details remained sensitive, and Patricia had never sought public acknowledgement of her involvement. Her children knew only that their mother had once helped federal authorities with an investigation related to hospital security, a vague description that satisfied their curiosity without revealing classified details. The story of how Patricia Morrison identified Alexei Volkov remains largely unknown outside intelligence and law enforcement circles, preserved in classified files and in the memories of the few people who were directly involved in the case. But within those circles, the case is studied as an example of how ordinary citizens can contribute to national security by maintaining awareness of their surroundings and trusting their instincts when something seems off. Patricia had no training in counterintelligence, no background in espionage detection, no sophisticated surveillance equipment. She had only her nursing experience, her knowledge of how patients typically behaved during recovery from cardiac surgery, and her willingness to report observations that troubled her despite the risk of appearing foolish or paranoid. The Volkov case illustrated several important lessons about Cold War espionage and the vulnerabilities that intelligence services on both sides worked to exploit. Soviet illegal agents like Volkov were trained to blend into American society so completely that they could operate for years without detection, maintaining cover identities that were supported by extensive documentation and backstory. These agents were patient and disciplined, avoiding behaviors that might attract attention and maintaining the fiction of their assumed identities, even under circumstances like medical emergencies that might cause others to break character. Volkov had undergone major cardiac surgery, experienced significant pain and discomfort, spent weeks in a vulnerable state, and never once revealed any indication that he was anything other than the businessman he claimed to be. But no amount of training could eliminate all the subtle tells that marked someone as different from what they claimed to be. Volkov's habit of keeping notes in both English and Cyrillic, his lack of emotional responses typical of patients in his situation, his watchfulness and environmental awareness, these small details created a pattern that Patricia Morrison's experienced eye had recognized as inconsistent with the cover story. Her nursing background had given her an informal baseline for how patients behaved, and Volkov's deviations from that baseline, though subtle, were sufficient to trigger her concern. The case also demonstrated the importance of creating environments where people felt empowered to report suspicions without fear of ridicule or reprisal. Patricia Morrison had hesitated before calling security, aware that she might be wrong and that her report could be dismissed as the product of an overactive imagination. But the hospital's security staff had taken her concerns seriously, and that validation had encouraged her to cooperate fully with the subsequent FBI investigation. In other circumstances, with less supportive leadership or more dismissive responses to her initial report, Patricia might have decided to keep her observations to herself, and Volkov might have completed his intelligence mission undetected. The broader implications of the case extended beyond the specific details of Volkov's operation. The fact that a Soviet intelligence officer had chosen to use a medical emergency and hospitalization as part of his cover story suggested that intelligence services recognized hospitals as relatively soft targets, places where security was focused on patient safety and medical care, rather than counterintelligence concerns. The protocols implemented after the Volkov case helped hospitals become more aware of this vulnerability, though the challenge of maintaining security while preserving the compassionate care environment essential to healing remained complex and ongoing. Thomas Brennan, the security officer who had taken Patricia Morrison's initial report seriously, later reflected in an interview for an internal FBI training document that the Volkov case had taught him the value of listening to frontline workers who had expertise in recognizing when something deviated from normal patterns. Nurses, he noted, spent more time with patients than physicians did, and developed intuitive senses for when patients were not behaving as expected. This intuition was not mystical or unscientific, but rather the product of extensive experience that created mental models of typical behavior that allowed for rapid detection of anomalies. Security professionals and intelligence officers could benefit from paying attention to these observations, rather than dismissing them as the concerns of civilians who did not understand the complexities of threat assessment. Agent Robert Callahan, who had led the FBI investigation, made similar points in a presentation to new agent trainees at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. The Volkov case, he argued, demonstrated that successful counterintelligence operations depended on more than sophisticated surveillance technology and expert analysts. They also required partnerships with ordinary citizens who were willing to report suspicious circumstances and who possessed specialized knowledge that allowed them to recognize when things were not quite right. A milkman who noticed unusual doorbells, a television repairman who recognized Soviet equipment, a shoe salesman who identified distinctive walking patterns, a nurse who observed behavioral inconsistencies. These were the people whose contributions had helped expose numerous espionage operations during the Cold War, and their willingness to act on their observations had protected national security in ways that remained largely unacknowledged. For Patricia Morrison, the experience had confirmed something she had long believed about nursing, that the work required more than technical competence and medical knowledge. It required careful observation, critical thinking, and the willingness to advocate for patients and for safety, even when doing so felt uncomfortable or uncertain. The skills that had made her an excellent cardiac nurse, attention to detail, pattern recognition, comfort with ambiguity, willingness to trust instinct while seeking validation through evidence, these were the same skills that had allowed her to identify Alexei Volkov as someone whose story did not quite add up. In that sense, her role in exposing a Soviet intelligence officer was not a departure from nursing, but rather an extension of the same vigilance that characterized her professional life. The night she had first noticed the appointment book with Cyrillic writing, Patricia Morrison had been tired from hours of monitoring cardiac rhythms and managing medications and responding to patient needs. She could easily have dismissed the observation as insignificant, attributed the mixed language notes to the routine international business dealings of a consultant, and continued her shift without reporting anything. Many people in her situation would have made exactly that choice, telling themselves that they were probably wrong and that involving security would create unnecessary complications. But Patricia had chosen differently. She had trusted the small voice of concern that told her something was off, had reported her observations despite uncertainty, and had followed through with cooperation when the FBI requested her assistance. That choice, made at 5:30 on a February morning in 1982, had set in motion events that ultimately protected classified information about American satellite systems, led to the arrest of a Soviet intelligence officer and his American accomplice, and prevented further compromise of defense secrets. Patricia Morrison had not sought to be involved in counterintelligence operations. She had simply done her job as a nurse with the same careful attention and professional integrity that characterized her entire career. And in doing so, she had demonstrated that protecting national security was not only the responsibility of intelligence professionals and military personnel, but also of ordinary citizens who maintained awareness, trusted their judgment, and had the courage to act when circumstances demanded it. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.